맡은 김도연입니다. 오늘 코인 인터뷰를 찾아주신 게스트는요, 스위치.io 피터 Hirshberg 회장님입니다. 안녕하세요. Hi. It's really honor for me to have an interview with you, Ms. Hirshberg. Please briefly introduce yourself to our coin interviewer.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm Peter Hirshberg. I've spent 30 years or so in Silicon Valley.
Okay.
Very early on, I was with Apple, back when we had to explain to people why they needed personal computers in the first place.
Wow.
And then worked on early internet companies, did one of the first social media search engines where, again, we had to explain to people why would you put content on the internet.
Sure.
And a lot of the work I've done recently has been around smart cities and the city as a platform. And that's led to blockchain as a new mechanism that essentially can connect people up and create new applications that actually create more of a global market.
Yes.
As cities are global.
Yes, and I've heard that you used to work at the Apple, right?
That's right. I actually joined Apple the year before Steve Jobs was thrown out for the first time.
Oh, really?
And, you know, early on, I mean, the problem in the very early days was to convince people why they needed personal computers. In fact, when I joined, there was a big question: were personal computers a fad? We did not know if they would go away.
Sure.
And there was this whole struggle to figure out what's the right use for a computer, because gaming was there very early on. The other very interesting thing was it took many years for it to become apparent that the real use of these things was for communications.
Okay.
Before the internet came out, communicating on a computer was complex. It involved a modem. Nobody was sure if it was for them.
True.
It was for like technical people in companies to do.
Yes.
So a lot of work went into to making that simple. And what is now so obvious about the internet, at the beginning took a lot of work to convince people about networking.
Okay. So, have you ever been to Korea before? Is it your first time or?
I've been here a couple of times, but you know, Korea is so advanced and changes so quickly. Every time is like a new time.
Oh, so how do you feel about being in Korea?
Yeah, I think for people in technology, Korea is special because one of the first places to adopt very fast internet. This is a population that is as consumed with the future of technology as any. When you talk to young people here, even the culture of blockchain and Bitcoin, the understanding that we're moving into a decentralized world and that this has big implications for politics and how we organize the world.
Yes.
I think you get a sense of that here before you get it in other places.
Okay. So, and you mentioned the Maker City project earlier. Would you tell us about the Maker City in details, please?
So this is fascinating. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We've heard of the Maker movement, and my friend Dale Doherty, who was the founder of Maker Faire and the Maker movement, we noticed a few years ago that people started using this word Maker City.
Yes.
It kind of had two meanings. One was all about economic development, 3D printers, new forms of production.
Yes.
The other was that people were actually involved in co-creating their cities. They were using open data, using code, solving problems in a city was becoming more than just what the government did.
Sure.
We called that Maker City. And we were also fortunate because about 4 years ago, during President Obama's administration, the president convened several White House Maker Fairs.
Oh.
So we had people doing all sorts of interesting stuff with science and new technology at the White House. And when we did that, we asked U.S. cities to become Maker Cities.
Oh.
100 cities signed up and said, we care about STEM and science and local production and the economics of all of this. And we realized when all these cities signed up, they were doing very interesting, advanced new things. Pittsburgh was transforming education. Another city, Chattanooga, was going into advanced internet. Other cities were transforming kind of how they were doing economic development based on these principles. We wrote a book on it.
Oh, that's
We
very
wrote a book called The
interesting.
Maker City.
Very interesting. So, is there any specific reason for establishing the Maker City project?
Well, yes, we established it. Here's the reason we established it. We noticed that so many cities were doing new things, but they were so busy executing that they weren't sharing these ideas with each other.
Okay.
And also, you can imagine, if you have innovative people in a city doing something new, everybody around them is like, what are you doing? Why are you having maker spaces? Why are you having new forms of entrepreneurship going on? What do you mean students can actually solve problems in a city? So people who are doing the most innovative things sometimes look a little weird to everybody else. So we wrote a book about this so that people could see the best practices, and then if somebody said, we don't understand what you're doing, they could pick up the book and throw the book at them.
Oh,
And by the way, the Maker City is available in Korean. Because there's a lot of reasons that, I mean, this is a great market.
so fascinating.
Yeah.
So why did it put so much effort on the city innovation?
No, this is a great question. This is because suddenly cities are where the action is. I mean, everybody knows that 70% of the world now lives in cities. Why is that? Why are people all of a sudden moving to cities? Well, amazingly, it turns out when people move to cities, they get smarter collectively. Incomes go up because when people are in a tight network and their ideas can bounce off of each other,
Yes.
they're more productive and more ideas happen. And it also turns out that because we have the cloud and technology, and it doesn't take as much money to start something, the most innovation happens in cities. So suddenly, how you manage that is the way you grow economies.
Mm-hmm.
Also, many of the problems we have today come from density in cities. Cities become too expensive, right? They're attracting lots of young people. Commercial space is changing. We go from traditional office buildings to co-working spaces. How do we build a city that has the right amenities and quality of lights and adapts all this digital technology? And importantly, how do we do it inclusively? You know, how does everybody become involved? So these questions of city innovation and including people in it become really important decisions today.
Okay.
And that's why the Maker City Project.
Yes, and I've heard of the publication of the Maker City recently. First of all, congratulations. How do you feel about it?
Well, you know, one of the most gratifying things about writing a book about this is about 2 years after you write it, you suddenly run into people and they say things like, those ideas changed our city. I was at a meeting the other day and I met a woman from Hartford, Connecticut. Now, Connecticut in the United States turns out to have been very strong in the old economy, lots of corporate headquarters, but in this new, more entrepreneurial economy, because it's a suburban city, they're not doing as well. She said she read this, she talked to an investor, they started building denser housing, co-working spaces, they started doing entrepreneurial new businesses because basically she took these ideas. So the most gratifying thing is to see how these ideas are connected up. That's a big thing I've learned.
Okay, so before we get into the details and the further question, would you tell us about the written preface about the Maker City? What is the reason for US being Maker City?
Yeah, well, the two things. The preface that you asked about, the beginning of the book, was actually written by a fellow named Tom Khalil, who was President Obama's technology advisor.
Okay.
And this was because that administration really believed that a way to advance the economy was to put a big focus on science and math, to put a big focus on new forms of industrial production, that 3D printing is the fourth industrial revolution. So the White House wrote the introduction to the book basically to share what we were learning in other cities. Now, you also asked, why did we focus on U.S. cities?
Yes.
Well, part of the reason was the U.S. is big and we have a lot of cities, and it was enough just to cover U.S. cities.
Okay.
And I think we also wrote it because we recognize that the U.S. has uneven economic development. Like the cities are doing, big cities are doing great, the smaller cities not so great.
Okay.
You could argue our whole presidential election was about that. So we kind of wrote that to smooth things out, even though the most interesting story is how maker cities in different countries, like when you connect up what Singapore is doing and Korea is doing and Spain is doing and what the U.S. is doing, that becomes really interesting.
True.
You learn a lot.
As far as I know, Maker City Project has an initiative since 2006, right? Would you tell us more details about this project?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned to you before, we noticed that people started using the term Maker City, and when we looked into it, we saw that there were really two components of it. One was, one of the things about social media is it moved power from big organizations to everybody, right? Suddenly we all had a voice. Well, that same thing, it turns out, was happening in cities. The same way that people had a voice and had some control over brands and media, when cities opened their data, when the crime data and the pollution data was open, ordinary citizens could see it, talk about it, and build applications. Likewise, the tools of production, manufacturing, they're being opened up, right? Now, any student in school has more compute power or the ability to use a CNC machine, which is a computer-controlled manufacturing device. So these tools are being democratized. And you want to share them with people and show people how. And so what we cover here is, what does this mean for the workforce? What does this mean for education? How do you start new companies with it? How does it even affect city planning? How can everyone get involved? So we wrote this almost to see how people in cities could use these new tools to make better cities.
Okay. Then, will you give us some examples of economical opportunity that Maker City has brought?
Yeah. Some of the best examples of this are when you look at regions in the city or cities that weren't doing well and did a lot better. One of my favorite ones in the United States is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Pittsburgh used to be a steel town, but then we moved from kind of a manufacturing economy to more of an information economy, and they did an amazing job of then becoming a software economy. And now they've really adapted to robots, autonomous vehicles, and they also transformed their education, right? So they realized about 10 years ago or so that students weren't learning as much because like they were always on their cell phones or playing games. So they asked, how could you make education as fun as a game?
Okay.
Well, by doing that, starting even in middle schools, they were teaching people these new skills, and that's helped the whole city attract a lot of talent, doing very, very well there. But there are other cities. I mean, you could look at a district like Brooklyn, New York, or Oakland. Oakland, California is the East Bay of California is the manufacturing analog of Silicon Valley. That's done very well. And it also works in smaller cities. The little town called Wenatchee, Washington transformed itself. And now we're working we're working with U.S. newspapers so that newspapers can help transform their own cities. I was in Kansas City the other day. They have depressed parts of town, and they're doing an amazing job starting at 2 or 3 years old in teaching kids these techniques. So kids grow up thinking, oh, I can change the world, I can make something. And that transforms how you think, especially if you grew up disadvantaged and you didn't think you had power.
That's just great. Then, how do you think about the Korean makers?
Yeah, well, I haven't spent that much time in Korea observing makers, but what I have noticed is that, I mean, this is a culture that adopts technology very early. And your maker movement here kind of started in a part of town that was full of electronic stores and technology, and then adopted a lot of the new capabilities here. I think one of the interesting things about making in Korea is, because people adopt technology so much, this is a culture where young people can get addicted to computers, or even addicted to like trading Bitcoin. One of the nice things about making is it's physical, right? You're not just on a screen. You're using a hammer, you're putting sensors in things, you're 3D printing something, you're having to go from thinking about what something is conceptually to actually making it. I think that makes more of a whole person, right?
True.
So I think the maker movement here is a very healthy thing in the society because in a way it grounds you. That's one of the reasons we wrote the book.
Okay.
We thought there was too much code going on, and there's also making.
Okay. Then what is the key point of establishing the maker city? Actually, you just told me, but is there any more details?
Yeah. Well, you know, the point here, we actually say that the purpose of a city, or the purpose of a maker city, is to prepare its people in a time of rapid technological and economic change. So if we look at what's going on in the world, we're going through enormous economic change, right? There's AI coming in that can displace traditional jobs. You know, both white-collar jobs like accounting and blue-collar jobs through robotics. And we're going from an era where people, like you went to school and then you went to work, now you always have to learn because things are changing.
Yes.
So the real purpose of this is how do families and neighborhoods and cities prepare themselves and think about that future, because you know it can be frightening.
Sure.
The negative side of this is populism, and you've seen around the world people get very defensive.
Sure.
The positive side is what we call flourishing localism. You learn new skills and you can get your city to be ahead. But that's very important right now.
Then how do you see the future of Maker City?
Yeah. Well, I think part of this is we want to see this diffuse out to reach even more and more diverse people. You know, when you start a movement like the Maker Movement, it starts out a little concentrated. It's a bit middle class, it's a bit people who grow up with these tools. We kind of need to include everybody, right? So, and if you look at this, this is the great agenda in the world. Clearly, if you look at China, they're trying to diffuse access to technology knowledge well into the countryside. If you look at what we're doing in the United States, we need to make sure that we cover kind of all economic backgrounds and races and inclusion, which means we have to invite people in.
Sure.
Not just people who wake up, I want to be there, but we have to expose more people to it. And in the US, we also have to make sure that smaller cities that don't have the advantage of density can take advantage of this so there's equal opportunity. So I think that's the big future, is sharing it with more people.
Okay, then do you have any colleague in 다시 갈게요. 네. 슛 주세요. Sorry. Okay. Okay, then do you have any colleague in writing the book, The Maker City?
Yeah, we had a great team working on this. There were 3 of us principally who did it. In addition to myself, there's Dale Doherty. Dale was the founder of the Maker Movement, the founder of Maker Faire and Make Magazine. So he's kind of like the pappy at making.
Okay.
So Dale was a co-author, and then Marcia Kadnoff. Marcia is another tech entrepreneur, one of Silicon Valley's top marketing people, and we worked together at Apple many years ago. So the 3 of us were the core team working on it. And then we had many other people working with us. There was a woman named Stephanie Santoso, who was President Obama's top advisor on making. She organized a lot of this. So the 4 of us really worked on it. It was a great team.
Oh, that's really nice. So, as far as I know, you established Switch based on Maker City. Would you please explain the detailed information about Switch token?
Yeah. So, Switch is conceived of to be a token or a blockchain device to accelerate the move towards renewable energy and also create incentives and value for that. So, as we know, there's no more global problem on Earth than climate change and CO2.
Yes.
It's global. Turns out the way that energy works today is it's all very local. The state of California has an incentive. They say, well, buy more solar. Or there might be an incentive in the European Union. Well, it turns out these are very fragmented, and a lot of the information that drives these comes manually, and it comes in slow. It's a classic example of kind of a market and an information system that doesn't work too well.
Okay.
So the concept of Switch is to bring that into a single market and to accelerate it. I'll give you a simple example. In Europe and in the United States, we have incentives for people to put in solar energy. Now, it turns out that in a place like California, we have so much green energy that if you add more, it might not be that useful in the middle of the day. Turns out if you added wind or solar in, say, Jamaica or India, or even in parts of Korea where you burn coal, a bit of green energy there would be 7 times more useful to the Earth. It would reduce carbon 7 times more. So the natural thing you'd want to do is take incentives where they want to invest in it in developed countries and make it show up where it'll do the most good. Like make it show up in fast move developing world. There's no way of doing that right now. But if you use sensors and you see what's going on, and then you can literally award value based on how much energy you're making and how much carbon you're reducing, boom,
Wow.
you can build a global market that way. That's what the promise that blockchain holds, but we haven't had those mechanisms today.
That's just so wow. So I wonder why you decided to choose energy as an alternative currency.
Well, one reason is, in many ways, this approach could be used in any form of commons. When we say commons, we mean something that we all share, and if we use too much of, we make a mess of it. So, water and fisheries are a good example of
Yes.
commons. we picked energy because it's very much related to climate, and that's kind of the world's biggest problem. And we were kind of annoyed that global leaders recognized they didn't have a solution to this. So, simple example, at the World Economic Forum this year, they said the global commons can't heal itself. And if you were at the Paris Climate Accords, you heard the West saying, how come we can't get the developing world and India to use more renewables? And India would say, well, you had a head start using coal, now it's our turn to develop. So these were examples of the mechanisms didn't exist to speed this up. So there's frustration. Essentially, the older generation was throwing up its arms and saying something's missing. And so what we're trying to do is take new techniques and help solve that.
So go up to the next question. In what point would this token resolve the problems?
Well, we won't resolve it alone, but what we think we can do is accelerate this transition. So here's one way of looking at it. You know how the world has targets to reduce carbon and move away from coal and fossil fuels?
Yes.
Okay. That's going to happen at a certain speed. So there's a curve, it's kind of like it ramps up and it happens out there in the future. If we can pull that into the left, we can just make it happen a few years earlier because we're providing incentives or information. The sooner it happens, the less global temperature rises and the less stringent the measures are we have to do. So we know we're working if we accelerate this trend, and we know we're working if we're driving capital to it and rewarding people, and we know we're working if we turn it into a movement. If people realize that by buying a token, say in Seoul, they understand that that will result in renewable energy showing up either to displace coal here or in a developing country, and that also the value of that would go up. So we're trying to build a system, a game, if you will, that as you play the game, you win by creating value and also reducing carbon.
Sure. So, actually, this was my question.
Yeah.
Does government cooperate any of this kind of system? I think it would be really helpful to the government.
Yeah, it is. It is because these are goals government wants to achieve.
True.
And it's a little bit different than Bitcoin. In Bitcoin was kind of built to challenge government currency. Right? It was a little bit of a shot across the bow, which is why governments are regulating it both because they have their own currency and they're also worried about speculation. In the case of Korea, kids staying at home playing Bitcoin and not going to school. Okay.
Absolutely.
In this case, most governments get up in the morning and they say, we actually have to reduce carbon. We want to drive people towards cleaner energy. So we find that there's a lot of cooperating with governments. Also, some government programs are coming to an end. Like in the European Union, their incentives will start phasing out in 2020. So a lot of the partners we're working with want to use Switch to start putting in place incentives when government leaves. For example, in Europe, as I mentioned, they start going out in 2020. We're working with a partner in Europe called E2M, one of the largest energy aggregators. Today, I can announce at the very launch of Switch, we already have 3.5 gigawatts operating in Europe.
Wow.
That's about enough for 500,000 homes. And the reason that we're working with E2M is they realize they have to get good at this, and Europe has to come up with something that supplements what the government does and that works across all countries. So in a way, we're helping governments do something they can't do on their own, which is to be more global.
Wow, that is so fantastic. Sorry, that is so fantastic. Was there any difficulties in developing the Switch?
Well, the biggest thing is it's a very big idea, right? So you kind of need, you have to find a way that you can implement a big idea, but do it kind of as easily as possible so you don't have to have too many players do it. In software, you can have a big idea, but if you require, the government and big companies and small companies and citizens and schools and everybody to want to do it, it's tough to get it started. So a lot of the work had to do with how can we design this so it can start in any small region. And so we spent a lot of time both on that business model and on how to start it. So, for example, as we launched in Europe, we have this large customer doing it. In the United States, there are companies that administer the current government programs. For example, there's a company, an Australian company called Lend-Lease that is now deploying this in the US with its customers because the current programs are very difficult to administer. There's fraud, there's inaccurate data, it takes a lot of manual time, they're trying to automate it.
Okay.
And we're also working with cities, so you'll hear an announcement soon with a number of European cities that want to build an incentive. They want their citizens to actually, have greener power and greener supply chain. So we'll use Switch both to measure and to create an incentive for that. So I think a lot of the work has been around how do you take a new idea and just kind of make it sit in there, which is like any technology marketing.
True. So there must be some team members you help to get rid of the difficulty you encounter.
Yeah.
Would you introduce them, please?
Yeah, well, this is part of the best part. I think the greatest thing about this project is the diversity of the team and a lot of clever ideas there. So, Dr. John Clippinger, who's at MIT, is at the MIT Media Lab, and he was involved in artificial intelligence years ago, like starting in the 1960s, very early on. And John and I did a book a few years ago on self-organizing emergent phenomena. It was actually called From Bitcoin to Burning Man and Beyond.
Okay.
Self-organizing cities, self-organizing contracts, self-organizing currency. So John saw this, and he hooked up with another person, Evan Caron, who was one of America's top energy traders and top renewable financing people. And the two of them saw that that was a inefficient market. It was slow moving, it was governed by old mechanisms, and that putting a currency into this thing could both speed up the transition and solve a big market problem. So those were two of the big partners that came in. And then we also hooked up with several companies to build it. So for example, we've been in Korea the last few days with Black & Veatch. They're one of the world's biggest creators of critical infrastructure. So they build large electric plants, solar plants, wind plants around the world. They're actually helping to build a lot of the software and implement it with us. So it's been a big team effort.
Wow. Would you please tell us about the future plan and the goal of the Switch?
Yeah, well, the goal is pretty simple. If we can accelerate renewable energy and reduce carbon, and in the course of that, create a market so that the value of Switch goes up as both the price of carbon goes up and as we start moving away from fossil fuels, we'll do very well. I think if you look at the future, in this first year, we're just launching it right now. The first thing we want to do is really prove it out, and prove it out at scale with very large partners. Hence, E2M that I mentioned, Lend-Lease, Black & Veatch. I think the next thing we want to do is have this become a movement. As we put sensors everywhere and we can measure energy, then for individuals, this can be a mechanism that creates value. If you put solar in your roof, you get value from that. Or if a company moves into a building, it can use this as a mechanism to both create value and to offset energy. So we want this to become kind of a much larger movement. And I think that's the next step. There's a story behind this. In a way, think of a superhero story where everybody bands together and conquers some unconquerable problem. Well, that unconquerable thing seems to be climate change. So we'd love to see Switch embedded in movies and TV shows, because as an idea, if we can diffuse this, even the way that, ideas and currencies diffuse in games, that will be a bigger thing.
Like for general.
Huh?
Like for general.
Yeah, so that's, the idea is start with a focused thing and then let's make it a movement. And by the way, blockchain is a movement. Tim Draper, who's one of the top investors in it, talks about the fact that the whole purpose of tokens are to bring about societal change. And we know we're in a big change from a fossil fuel economy to a green economy, from a centralized world to a decentralized world. We want to be part of that movement.
Wow. So we've talked about, 다시 할게요. Okay, so we've talked about many things about Maker City and Switch today, right? And is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, I think I think one of the interesting things to add is where all of this sits, kind of in where the Earth is right now. The 20th century was very much about centralized top-down control. So big institutions, big corporations, but as you've noticed, in the world, people are losing faith in centralized institutions. Banking, Bitcoin famous for that. There's less faith in governments. We see populism going on kind of across the board. What is coming out instead now are these decentralized mechanisms. And it's not that we don't believe in politics, it's that we live in a complex world where you have to make lots of decisions and you're ingesting lots of data. And that's what this is great for. So, and this is what smart contracts are great for. If you can build a smart contract that says you're going to be awarded more value for the actual carbon you displace and the green energy you produce, that's actually part of this movement that gives more control, faster decision making, and it supplements what governments do. Right? So I think this is part of this, what I think is a hopeful trend. It looks like we're at a time of rapid transition. It looks like the younger generation's not as interested in politics. What we're really saying is there's new mechanisms for a new era. And everything that I've been describing for you is really based on 2 Nobel Prize winners and someone who won't even tell us his real name.
Oh.
Well, that would be Satoshi Nakamoto, who came up with Bitcoin in response to the banking crisis. But also underneath that was a Nobel Prize in 2006 for mechanism design.
Yes.
It says you can build a game that motivates people and you can get the result you want, like climate change. So we're adapting those ideas. And then in 2008, Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for Commons. And she noticed common pools. She said if you share data and you actually collaborate, you can get a better solution. The old economy was a winner take all. You know, it was industrial. In the information economy, there actually is a way of collaborating. So we've tried to design something, and not just us, other people in this movement, that take these ideas and build a game where when we win that game, the Earth is better off, and we've created value. And of course, Korea is a wonderful place to help build that game because this is a culture of technology, of gaming, and of new currencies, and that's why we've done so much of the seed work here.
Okay, so we're up to last question.
Yeah.
Please leave your remarks to our coin review. 다시 할게요. Okay, so we're up to last question. Please leave your remarks to our coin interview. 죄송합니다. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Coin interview. I was just gonna say viewer. Okay. So we're up to last question. Please leave your remarks to our viewers.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's been a great pleasure to be here. And this is such a fast-moving world that I would invite you all to learn more. And you can visit us at switch.io, which is SWYTCH.io. If you're interested in the Maker City, that is at makercity.com. Between those two, you'll learn a lot.
Yes.
And also, we'd love you to look into Switch and think of it not just as a coin and a blockchain mechanism, but it's really a new mechanism for a new era. It's a way to create kind of a global market around energy and climate change. It's a way to create value so that the greener we get, the higher the value. We think of the sun as our reserve currency.
Okay.
And I'll leave you with this final thought. You know, one of the raps on Bitcoin is it consumes a lot of energy, right? In order to do Bitcoin mining, you have to consume energy and you have to emit carbon.
Okay.
Blockchain uses a proof of production mechanism. In our case, the scarce thing is the production of energy. We see what's being produced right at the device level, so we actually produce energy and reduce carbon.
Okay.
So if you can create value in that, you're onto something big early.
So that concludes our interview today. 다시 할게요. So that concludes our interview today. Thank you so much for joining us. And 고맙습니다. 오늘 인터뷰에 응해주신 네. 잠깐만요. If I say thank you so much for joining us, then you can just like
Thank you
answer
very
to
much.
me. Yeah.
Oh, that would be great.
And I'm gonna just finish up with the Korean.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Oh, so at the end we're going to act like we're talking.
Yes, yes, yes.
Can we actually talk?
Yes.
Good, fine. We'll actually talk. Good.
So that concludes our interview today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, this has been great. It's so wonderful to be able to share this with your audience, and I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. 네, 알겠습니다. 오늘 인터뷰에 응해주신 스위치아이오 피터 허스버그 회장님 정말 고맙고요. 네. 한국말로요? 네. 네, 알겠습니다. 오늘 인터뷰에 응해주신 스위치아이오 피터 허스버그 회장님 정말 고맙습니다. 인터뷰가 준비한 내용은 여기까지고요. 코인 인터뷰는 앞으로도 유익한 코인 정보를 제공해드리기 위해서 노력하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.